Good day. Today is Thursday, 10th April 2025, and 8 days from the start of Liberation Day, we now have what, to all appearances, is not maybe a U-turn exactly, but it's certainly not a pause. It has the look about it of a screeching stop, at least on the part of the president and his advisors in their new program of tariffs directed against the world. I should make it clear, reciprocal tariffs, supposedly, tariffs punishing other countries for their supposedly unfair practices against the United States. Moreover, the way in which the pause has been carried out makes it look even more clearly as if the United States is drifting into an economic war against China, even though the president himself doesn't appear to want that outcome. I say the president himself because Donald Trump issued a comment on Truth Social, which seems to suggest that, in fact, he is basically very much still holding out for some kind of deal, some sort of agreement with China. Anyway, let's first of all begin with what Donald Trump said yesterday, his Truth Social post, which perhaps provides us with some understanding of what is in his mind. And it starts with these words: based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world's markets. I'm not clear about which world markets President Trump is talking about, but anyway, let's continue. I'm hereby raising the tariff charged to China by the United States to 125%, effective immediately. At some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the USA and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Full stop. That's the first two sentences, and we see that China is there, starting at the top of the president's mind and starting the wording of his Truth Social post. It then continues. Conversely, and based on the fact that more than 75 countries have called representatives of the United States, including the Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and the USTR, to negotiate a solution to the subjects being discussed relative to trade barriers, tariffs, currency manipulation, and non-monetary tariffs, and that these countries have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the United States, I have authorized a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period of 10%, also effective immediately. Thank you for your attention. Well, it is very, very garbled, but let's just pass that again. I'll skip the part that relates to China, and we'll talk about the other countries. Based on the fact that more than 75 countries have called representatives of the United States to negotiate a solution to the subjects being discussed relative to trade barriers, tariffs, currency manipulation, and non-monetary tariffs, and that these countries have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the United States, I have authorized a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff. Well, 75 countries. Which countries are those exactly? I say that because, so far as I am aware, the president himself has had conversations with South Korea and Japan. He's also met with the Prime Minister of Israel And that, as far as I can see, is just about it. We know that Vietnam approached the United States to suggest zero tariffs by Vietnam on American goods in return for zero tariffs by the United States against Vietnamese goods, and that the United States rejected that proposal. Apparently, some other countries have also contacted the United States and have had the door slammed in their face. This is what has been happening over the last week. Does that come to 75 countries? I'm not aware that it does. I've seen no evidence at all that it does. And presumably some of the countries that the President has in mind are the European Union countries. The European Union, far from not taking retaliatory action, was in the process, as the President was writing his Truth Social post, it was in the process of taking retaliatory action with preparations for a 25% tariff on selected American goods imported into the European Union, including, I understand, American steel products. So, which countries? All of this, by the way, just a couple of hours after Peter Nabarro, the President's tariff manager, if I can call him that, was writing in the Financial Times that the reciprocal tariffs were not intended as a ploy in bargaining, they were for real, and that they would remain in place basically indefinitely. Well, straightforwardly, I don't buy the suggestion that this was done because countries were approaching the United States and trying to negotiate with the United States new tariff deals. I suspect that the reason that the President did what he did is the one that you will find right across the media today. I have absolutely no doubt of this. It was because there were problems in the financial markets, first and foremost problems in the bond markets. There was the first telltale signs of a major sell-off in US treasuries. Yields on treasuries were starting to spike. In other words, the interest the American government was having to pay on treasuries, on American government bonds, was increasing. The United States has to roll over something like 7 or 9, there's many different figures being thrown about, $1 trillion worth of debt apparently this year, government debt. The President is anxious apparently to reduce the debt burden that the United States is carrying. All of the evidence pointed to major increases in the debt burden. He wants to reduce the debt burden because he's anxious to cut taxes. This is going against his policy of cutting taxes. And of course, if there had been a full-scale bond crisis, if there had been a collapse in confidence in Treasury bonds, if there'd been a massive outflow of funds from the United States, given the extent of the debt burden, it would have created a massive crisis, and, well, one can't quite guess where it would all have gone. Now, about a week ago, the British economic historian Adam Tooze wrote an article speculating about precisely this possibility. He thought it was unlikely that it would happen, but sure enough, yesterday it began to do so. The President's economic advisors, most specifically his Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, explained all of this to him yesterday. The President is familiar with the concept of bonds. It's been pointed out in the Washington Post that he understands the importance of all of these matters and the way they play out, because of his own experience in the highly leveraged world of New York real estate and business and all of that. And he understood that he was dicing with a catastrophic debt crisis of potentially existential dimensions, and then, therefore, and for that reason, he backed off. Not because 75 countries supposedly were beating to his door, begging him to agree to negotiations with them in order to come to some kind of deal with him. So it was the bond market, basically, that did it. And, well, that then brings us back to the question of how we got here. Now, it's important to say that the president has not reversed his tariff policy. As I've discussed in program after program, the president, Donald Trump, believes in tariffs. He is an advocate of protectionism. He's never made any secret about this. He's talked about this since the 1980s. He's, in fact, even published, as I understand it, a full page advertisement in the New York Times in 1986 or 1987 advocating tariffs. He genuinely and sincerely believes that tariffs are the way to regenerate American manufacturing and American industry and the American economy, and that it is through tariffs that the various communities, the formerly industrial heartland of the United States, which has voted for him in recent elections and which he sees as a critical part of his electoral base, it is amongst those people, it is those people that he thinks he is going to help by pursuing his policy of tariffs. Now, it's not at all clear from his Truth Social post what he actually means, because he talks about a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period of 10%. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, we found out what it meant in the hours that followed, which is that the blanket tariff that he has imposed pretty much on all the trading economies of the world, with the important exception of Russia, is now at 10%. So we have, in effect, a straight 10% across the board tariff on everyone. Except, of course, that there are other tariffs that are higher. There continues to be a 25% tariff on automobiles, on motor vehicles, on certain other important categories of goods. Some countries, Canada and Mexico, are also affected by higher tariffs as well. There's been a recalculation done, and the latest calculation is that tariffs overall now have a weighted value relative to goods imported to the United States at 15%. 15% of the value of all imported goods. Now, I should say, I presume that a disproportionate part of that 15% is made up of goods imported or formerly imported by the United States from China. But one way or the other, we see that the United States, despite the retreat that took place yesterday, has moved from a position of essentially having no tariffs or very few tariffs when the president was inaugurated to a position where actually it still has relatively high tariffs, higher tariffs than it had during the golden era of protection in most of the 19th and early 20th century. Just saying. Anyway, there was another justification given yesterday for these moves. Once the story that all of these countries have been coming to the United States to negotiate a reduction in the reciprocal tariffs basically stopped being made, there was a new story, which, by the way, has not really been repeated by the president himself. There's a new story that, in fact, this was all a cunning plan to isolate China from the rest of the world trade system. China, of course, is now subject to 125% tariffs, astonishingly high tariffs, and of course China itself has imposed 84% tariffs on American goods exported to China. And these tariffs are achingly high, and they, in effect, have halted trade to any substantial degree, direct trade to any substantial degree between the United States and China. If you go to the Financial Times today, you will read all sorts of reports about Chinese businesses and Chinese merchants and shippers stopping the movement of cargoes from China to the United States, presumably bringing those goods back into warehouses, stockpiling these goods of Chinese businesses, agonizing about what they're going to do with all of these goods that they've been exporting to the United States. And in effect, the Chinese export trade to the United States has come to a juddering stop. The same is going to be true, incidentally, for the American export trade to China. We don't get reports about that, but again, American exporters of goods like oil, food, computers, machine tools, that kind of thing, aircraft engines, which apparently the United States also exports to China, all of that suddenly has stopped also. We have a juddering stop of that too. So we are looking, as of this moment, at a complete rupture of Chinese-American trade. Now, yesterday, after President Trump announced his pause, the stock markets all surged, financial markets recovered, the situation in the bond market, the US bond market, and indeed global bond markets stabilized. There was a huge surge of relief, probably because most people in the markets didn't notice that some of the tariffs, a lot of the tariffs, are still in place, with little sign that the president has any intention of relaxing them or lifting them. And they also appear to have ignored that the core problem, the issue at the center of this whole crisis, the trade between China and the United States, by far the biggest bilateral trade carried out in the world. Anyway, that is still not only affected by these tariffs, it is now, in fact, even worse, with even higher tariffs against Chinese goods, in effect preventing their export to the United States. As I said, the markets don't seem to have grasped that this was happening. Now, over the next couple of hours, over the course of the night, this does seem to have gradually percolated through, and markets, as they reopened this morning in the Far East, in Europe, have been starting to edge down again. And they've been edging down again in the United States also. In fact, I suspect the only thing that has prevented a further plunge in stock market prices, maybe not so much in treasuries, where maybe things have now stabilized sufficiently. But the main reason why the financial markets did not fall further, or have not fallen further yet today, is because of news that inflation growth in the United States in March, according to preliminary figures, which, by the way, are very, very often amended and sometimes amended upwards. Anyway, according to those figures, inflation in the United States in March at 2.4% at an annualized rate was somewhat lower than expected. Now, to my mind, by the way, that is not good news at all. It reinforces my own belief that the US economy was already moving towards recession before the tariffs were ever imposed or even talked about. In fact, I would not be surprised at all if the US economy were already in recession, and if it were to be confirmed at some point, maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, when all the figures are revisited, that it has actually been in recession for some time, maybe since late last summer. Just saying. So what was perhaps a recession signal was seen as a good indicator of things getting better, and that may have cushioned the fall in the stock markets today, because these enormous tariffs on China remain in place. That is going to have a catastrophic effect on world trade, not just trade between China and the United States, which is now effectively at a standstill. And, of course, all of the other tariffs remain in place also, but it is the China tariffs that are the heart of the problem. Now, the president is clearly very angry by the fact that the Chinese have not come to heel. It's absolutely clear to me now, from listening to the president speak, to what he said in his Truth Social post when he spoke about his call to the president of South Korea the day before yesterday, to statements that he's made over the course of the day about how he still wants a deal, to his statements on his latest Truth Social post, that he expected that the Chinese would come to heel very quickly. He'd been led to believe this by all sorts of people and had the assumption that the Chinese would back down. And to his dismay and anger, they have not backed down. And we see this in the words of his Truth Social post. Based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world's markets, I am hereby raising the tariff charged to China by the United States of America to 125% effective immediately. At some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the United States and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Now, lack of respect by China to world markets? How has China shown disrespect to world markets? They didn't initiate this whole round of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. It was the President of the United States and his administration who did. The only steps they've taken up to now have been responsive. If anyone has shown disrespect to anyone, it is, certainly to world markets, it is the President. And of course, he continued to show a certain disrespect towards world markets yesterday when he said that one of the reasons he'd ordered the pause was because people had gone yippee and had obviously not listened to his sage advice to remain calm and perhaps even to buy whilst the tariffs were in effect. But anyway, let's not dwell on this. He then talks about how at some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the USA and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Well, if he'd limited that to the United States, if he'd said that at some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the United States is no longer sustainable or acceptable, I would have understood where he was coming from. I might not have agreed with him. As I have said many times, the United States is very angry with China because China ran a big trade surplus with the United States, refusing to acknowledge that that Chinese trade surplus is at least as much the product of American policy decisions as it is of Chinese ones. In fact, one can go further and say that the Chinese worked very hard and very successfully to make the most of opportunities presented to them, that anyone else in their position would have done the same, human nature being what it is, that they worked very hard and very successfully to make the most of those opportunities, and that the blame for America's economic problems ultimately lies with those who have been making economic decisions in the United States for the last 50 plus years, economic decisions which have sacrificed fundamentals of American economic interest to achieve geopolitical goals. That, as far as I am concerned, is where the major blame for America's economic problems ultimately lies. But all right, I understand that there are many people in the United States who feel differently, particularly in the heartland areas, in cities and towns, steel towns and industrial towns. It's perhaps understandable if people, in fact, it is fully understandable if factories close and people are thrown out of work, if they blame the Chinese for this because it is Chinese competition that is driving out their goods they used to produce from the American markets, if it is that which is causing local production to close, if it is that which is causing people to lose their jobs. I can understand that, and I can understand why talking about China in the way that the president does makes political sense, even if it doesn't make historical sense or economic sense. And of course, it's important always to remember that the president is a politician. But why is he talking about other countries? Which other countries? Which other countries have been coming out and complaining that China has been ripping them off economically as well? Does he mean the European countries? Does he mean Germany, which has had excellent economic relations with China? Does he mean France, which is the same? Italy too. All of these countries have had major exports and a successful trade with China. Does he mean Britain? Britain has changed its policies and orientation towards China, but not so very long ago, the British government of David Cameron and George Osborne was going out of its way to try to create a golden age of relations, as they put it, between themselves and China. Europe only began to shift in its attitudes to China and has only done so very, very imperfectly under American pressure. So which other countries does he mean? Does he mean African countries? Does he mean countries in Latin America? Does he mean other Asian countries? Does he mean Russia? Which countries? I don't think the President of the United States should speak on behalf of other countries. Again, that, to my mind, makes the whole thing, the whole statement, look Well, frankly, more than a little weak and entitled, which I think is generally unhelpful at this time. But anyway, all right, the president is very disappointed that the Chinese have not come on hands and knees and begged him to compromise on the tariffs. What the president must, however, understand is that the policies that he has implemented against China, the tariff policies, are extremely dangerous in the short and medium term, at least for the United States, perhaps in the long term also, that China produces large numbers of goods which it's going to be very difficult for the United States to replace, that all of those goods which the Financial Times is telling us Chinese shippers are now stopping in mid-transit and which will not be coming to the United States after all, or which will only be coming at very, very much higher prices, are goods which the United States consumers were seeking to buy, and for which no obvious and immediate replacement exists. And of course, there are finished consumer goods, but there are also subcomponents. There's all kinds of other things the Chinese also supplied to the United States, some of them vital for American supply chains. A question which the issue of supply chains being something that the president himself does not seem to fully understand, the importance of which he doesn't seem to fully understand. So at some point, in some way, I think if he is indeed going to stabilize the situation in the financial markets, if he is indeed going to avoid a major crisis within the economy in the United States, apparently he's told his economic advisors that though he's prepared to accept a recession, he's not willing to accept what he calls a depression. I'm not sure what the distinction is, by the way, but never mind. Anyway, if he doesn't want this to become a major crisis, he's got to find some way to bring down these tariffs. Now, the Chinese, as I explained in my program yesterday, believe they can see the president out. There is another statistic which I hadn't mentioned yesterday, but which I'm starting to see mentioned by various sources, that China's exports to the United States now account for, well, some say 3% of China's GDP, others say 2.5% of China's GDP. There are other claims that if one adds Chinese goods which have been exported to the United States through third parties, mostly, it seems, Vietnam, then the true total is 4% of GDP. Now, China can probably absorb that blow. It has the ability to reflate its economy, to increase consumption within China. There have been many complaints and a lot of bafflement in the West as to why over the last 5 years, since the end of the pandemic, Xi Jinping's government has repeatedly pulled the punches on expansion within China itself. Well, I have to say this, the messaging from China is as follows, and you can believe this or not as you wish, that Xi Jinping and his officials had come to understand fully that some great blow was coming from the United States. They weren't sure what form it was going to take, and that they were husbanding their fiscal firepower to respond to this blow. That may be true. I suspect it is. Those who say that China doesn't have the resources to conduct a fiscal expansion, a further expansion, I am sure are mistaken. China still has enormous reserves which it can draw upon, tap on, in order to create that kind of expansion. And I think, given that we're talking about between 2.5% and 4% of GDP, I think the Chinese can do it, and it will not be a massive problem for them. Most likely, they will have a recession. They will have economic problems over the next year, perhaps two. But Xi Jinping and his officials can point to the United States, can point to Donald Trump, and they can quite truthfully tell their people that if there is going to be a recession, if there are going to be short-term falls in living standards, if some people are going to lose their jobs, this is not the government's fault. It is the fault of the government of the United States. And given the events of the last couple of days and the language, the very strong anti-Chinese rhetoric pouring out of Washington for the moment, that is not going to be a difficult message to sell to the Chinese people. So that's what I think the Chinese are going to do. I do not believe, by the way, that the Chinese are going to rush off and dump all of these goods that they're not selling to the United States on Asian consumers. China, as has been pointed out to me in an email, already runs trade surpluses with these countries, and I don't think it has any intention of doing any of those things. I think, as I said, more likely we're going to see steps taken to expand consumption within China, which has been steadily increasing anyway. So that, I think, is what China is likely to do. And of course, it is going to press forward to develop other export markets. All of this, of course, if the tariffs remain at these impossible levels. If American tariffs are brought down, then exports of Chinese goods to the United States will resume. Now, by the way, and just in parenthesis, even if these impossibly high tariffs remain in place, at some point, some Chinese goods will still begin to enter the United States, trafficked, if you like, to the United States via all kinds of intermediaries and third parties. We could start seeing in the United States a black market even beginning to appear for some types of Chinese goods, particularly, well, lower-end consumer goods, which would come in at cheaper prices. I'm not going to waste time discussing this in this program because I don't think we're going to get there. I'm sure that the tariffs at some point are going to be reduced instead. The president has to do that because if he doesn't do it, at some point the financial markets will light on the implications of that, and problems in the domestic economy and the United States financial system will resume. The president, however, because he thought that the Chinese would come to him, now has to find some way of initiating these discussions. And that might be particularly difficult considering the rhetoric that has been coming out of the administration about how China has malignant economic practices, that it needs to be punished, that it needs to be put in a corner, that an economic war against China is the correct and proper thing to do. So, how does he do it? Well, he's going to have to do it, it seems to me, through third parties. Picking up the phone and talking to Xi Jinping is going to be very difficult. I've discussed in many programs how if you look at readouts, if a country identifies who initiated the call, then that is usually a sign that it wants to make it clear that it is the other side that is the supplicant. And you can be absolutely certain that that will happen in this case. So you have to get this process started. The Chinese show no sign and appear to be in no mood to compromise. I've read articles, by the way, both in the Financial Times and in The Economist and in Unheard, all of which say the same thing, that China believes that it is in a strong position, that it is ready for the battle, that it can see out this battle with the administration. So the Chinese are not going to make the call. The president has to make the call, but in his own political interest, he's got to use third parties. Fortunately, there are a lot of third parties out there who probably would be prepared, if they were contacted by the US, if it were done discreetly, would be prepared to come forward and act as mediators between the United States and China and set up a meeting or discussions of some kind in a way that would save everybody's face. Now, I have to say, I expect that over the next few weeks, something like that will happen, maybe even days rather than weeks. At that point, following the logic of what he has done with the other reciprocal sanctions, the president should either cancel his sanctions entirely, his tariffs, his reciprocal tariffs on China entirely, bringing tariffs back down to 20%, or at least reduce them drastically. And then we would be back to that long negotiation on sorting out trade positions, which we saw during the president's first term and which we will have to see again, and which eventually might lead to some sort of agreement about how trade between China and the United States might be rebalanced in some ways, how steps could be taken to reduce the Chinese trade surplus, or perhaps we might not even reach that kind of agreement. If the president wants to reduce China's trade surplus with the United States, the solution to do so lies within the United States itself. He needs to do that which Republican presidents always promise to do, but never actually do, which is reduce the American budget deficit. If and once that is done, the Chinese trade surplus will fall. Anyway, there we are. Now, what this episode has illustrated yet again is the fact that the United States doesn't know very much about China. I was reading comments by a US businessman, I think it was, about how the United States, how the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, for example, how he didn't know very much about China at all. And when the problems of dealing with China were pointed out to him, and that the Chinese economy was much stronger than he assumed it was, this was all the way back in 2013. Scott Bassett didn't want to hear. There's a comment about that on Twitter X, by the way. I think this applies to all sorts of other US officials as well. I think they listen far too much to all sorts of commentators who tell them that China is a house of cards, that all the United States needs to do is to blow hard enough and the house of cards will collapse. I don't believe it is a house of cards at all. I think, on the contrary, that it is a rock against which the United States, if it kicks, it will stub its toe. So I think that we have a lot of foolish misunderstandings about China. But this whole episode, and I'm sorry to say this, tells us an awful lot about the political and economic practices of this administration. The president continuously comes across as being a man in a hurry. He wants to do extraordinary things, and he wants to do them very fast. He wants to end the fighting in Ukraine. He speaks about doing it in 1 day, then he talks about doing it in 100 days. He insists that this process must be moved forward at warp speed. He doesn't seem to grasp that others, the Russians in this case, have their own agendas and their own concerns, which are at variance with his own, and that he has little leverage over the Russians. And the result is that after a very promising start, his attempts to leverage, to force the parties into some kind of a peace in Ukraine have become bogged down and have entirely stopped. He's approached China on this whole issue of the Chinese trade surplus in the same way. He believes that he can do a deal with China almost immediately, that he can coerce and bully China into making massive concessions to the United States on trade. He completely underestimates both China's economic strength and the strength of its resolve. On this issue, by the way, he also underestimates attitudes within the United States itself. We've had comments, for example, by Jim Garrity in National Review. Jim Garrity, fervid conservative, a strong critic of Donald Trump's, a neocon to his fingertips, somebody who, as he openly admits, actually does want to see a total economic divorce between the United States and China. But in his latest article in National Review, he says this: Americans may not be as supportive of high tariffs on Chinese goods as I thought. The latest numbers from the Pew Research Center indicate that twice as many Americans think higher tariffs on China will be bad for the country as those who think they will be good. And then there's a quote: around half of Americans, 52%, anticipate this change will be bad for the United States, and a nearly identical share, 53%, say they will be bad for them personally. Around a quarter of Americans, 24%, think the increased tariffs on China will be good for the country. About half as many think they will be good for them personally. Roughly 1 in 5 Americans are unsure about the potential impact of these tariffs, both on the country and their own lives. When it comes to their own lives, some say these tariffs will have no effect either way, 17%. There is no enthusiasm, in other words, in the United States amongst the wider American public for a prolonged trade war with China. Donald Trump's core constituency supports protection, But the majority of the American people do not want an economic war with China that might result in a fall in their living standards and what for many of them are already difficult lives made more difficult still. And whilst, as I said, China will no doubt also suffer hardship as a result of such an economic war, as I also said, Xi Jinping and his officials can blame all of that legitimately on Donald Trump and on the United States, whereas it is most unlikely indeed, after all that has happened over the last few weeks, that Americans will blame China in the same way. So, notwithstanding all of that, the president rushed in without proper consultation, without looking at attitudes across the United States, into an economic battle with China, which he assumed he could end quickly. And what he got instead was a crisis in the bond markets, which might be there also. He's also been in a hurry on other things. He's constantly telling people that the problems with TikTok will be resolved quickly, that there are buyers ready to buy TikTok. The deals are all but round the corner, except it turns out that they are not. He's had to extend the deadline on TikTok for another 75 days. He talks in the same way about Iran. He speaks sometimes about deals with Iran being round the corner. He imposes impossible deadlines on the Iranians of 2 months in order for them to come to terms with him. This approach of rushing to get everything sorted out at warp speed, it's not producing results, it's creating problems. The president has not achieved a ceasefire in Ukraine. Instead, we have a Russian offensive underway instead. The president has not forced China to back down and cut a deal with him. The Chinese have imposed reciprocal tariffs, and there are now symptoms of crisis across the entire global system. The president has not been able to sell TikTok. The president has not yet managed to do a deal with Iran. The president must slow down, and he must negotiate in a more structured way. There are reports that his vice president, J.D. Vance, and Scott Bessent were telling him over the last couple of days that he needed to take a more structured approach to this whole tariff policy. And he needs to take a more structured approach on all of these questions. And he must also prioritize more carefully. In a program on the Duran, which Alex Christoforou and I have just done, and which should be appearing fairly shortly on the Duran, we agreed that, for example, sorting out problems with Russia is something that could be done relatively quickly and relatively easily if it is addressed in a proper way. If there's an understanding, for example, that the problems of Ukraine have to be put to one side, and that the improvement in the relationship between the United States and Russia cannot be held hostage to that extremely intractable problem. Anyway, he has to learn to prioritize. He has to learn to take his time, and he's got to consult more widely and to develop a team which is less factionalized and contains fewer people who pull him in wrong directions. I think that no small role in the failure, the debacle of the last couple of days was that disastrous statement that appeared on the White House website by the president's advisor, Stephen Duran, which made the whole business of tariffs seem less like an attempt to take economic steps to rebuild the economy of the United States, and more as a method to create some kind of protection racket over America's trading partners, obliging them to pay the United States for the benefit of having the American empire thrust upon them. That kind of messaging has disastrous consequences, and it should be abandoned. Well, my own view is that the president has perhaps a month to pull things together. If in a month's time we still have tariffs as high as this between the United States and China, then we are indeed going to head in the United States into a very severe recession indeed. That will probably start to pull down Europe as well, much of the global economy. Perhaps in time, say in 1 or 2 years, we could start to see some rebound in the United States. But in the meantime, very, very extensive damage will be done. And almost certainly, the president's party will lose its control of Congress, and the president's presidency will at that point start to unravel. So he has about a month, in my opinion, to turn things round. He needs to get that deal done with China to reduce the tariffs. I think if he keeps his 10% tariffs and the various other non-reciprocal tariffs that he has imposed, well, it should perhaps not be such a vast problem, at least not in immediate terms. Whether the long-term consequences will be any good, well, that's a different question completely. But the priority has to be, and it should be the priority to which the president now gives his overriding attention, is to get himself and the United States out of this hole with China that he has dug himself into. Now, the other thing that the president and his officials need to take away from all of this is that this new sanctions package that is moving through Congress, threatening to impose 500% tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil, is another disaster in the making. If the president has found that 100% tariffs on Chinese goods creates a crisis in the United States, affects the United States itself, then just take a step back and think what 500% tariffs might do. The Chinese are not going to stop buying Russian oil. It is ridiculous to think that they will. This whole sanctions package that Lindsey Graham is trying to put together is an idiocy, and that idiocy needs to be dropped. If nothing else has been taken from this episode, then that point, if it is understood, will at least be something. Anyway, there we are. That's what I'm going to say about this tariff debacle today. The president needs to think carefully in future about what he's doing. He needs to move step by step. Rushing into things in the way that he has done doesn't work, and we have seen how grave and potentially catastrophic the consequences of that can be. I'm now going to turn to the two other topics that I intend to touch on in this program, which is the situation in Ukraine, the war there, the ongoing war there, and the negotiations between the United States and Iran, which apparently are imminently going to start, or perhaps have already started, in Oman. Now, let's first of all look to the situation in Ukraine. The first thing to say is that before we even talk about Ukraine, there has been another meeting in Istanbul between the Russians and the Americans. This is a meeting of middle-ranking officials. The Russian delegation is led by their new ambassador to the United States, Mr. Darchev, and this is purely a discussion, a technical discussion about how to facilitate the work of the American and Russian embassies in the respective countries. These embassies have been barely functional for the last 3 years. They were already badly affected by decisions made during the last weeks of Barack Obama's presidency. The Russians apparently suggested right at the outset, in the very first conversation that Putin and Trump had with each other back in February, that steps be taken to get these embassies working again. There's already been one meeting in Istanbul, which lasted around 8 hours. This has been the follow-up meeting that has also taken place in Istanbul, also intended to make it possible for the embassies to start working again. And I'm going to make a guess that the major sticking point will be the return to the Russians of diplomatic property, various residences and buildings belonging to the Russian mission to the United States, which was seized in Barack Obama's time. The Russians claim illegally in violation of international law and of the Vienna Convention. The Americans have never, in all of the various discussions that the Americans and the Russians have conducted with each other, shown any willingness to bend on this question. It will be a very difficult thing politically, I suspect, for the Trump administration to do so. But I suspect that this is the major sticking point in the discussions, and we will see whether or not any movement takes place or whether some kind of compromise or at least some way round this problem can be found to allow the embassies to function properly once more. Already some steps have been made. The Russians have been able to appoint an ambassador, and he's been able to present credentials, presumably to Trump himself. But it seems a lot still needs to be done. And the meeting lasted 6 hours today, and we will see what the results will be. The Russians have a habit of releasing a summary of the discussions, a readout, in 1 or 2 days' time. So that's one meeting. Now, the Russians have also conducted with the Americans another prisoner exchange, exchanging American prisoners for Russian prisoners. I don't have the full details, but this is always a goodwill gesture conducted at moments like this, and it might help ease the tensions and give Donald Trump at least something to show as evidence that his outreach to the Russians is achieving something. Both the Russians and the Americans have gone out of their way to make clear that these discussions in Istanbul have no bearing on the conflict in Ukraine and have only a tangential relevance to the issue of full normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. Now, about the situation in Ukraine, there's an awful lot to say, an awful lot of developments over the last 24 hours. But before I deal with that, I would like to address an issue about Russian glide bombs, concerning which I've had a really very helpful email from someone whom, of course, I'm not going to name. It's one of these members of the community who has provided me with information from time to time. Now, yesterday, it was explained to me, I read an article in The Guardian, an interview that The Guardian had made with a Ukrainian former Azov Brigade officer, Bogdan Krotevich. And I noticed that in the article, in passing, there was a comment made that the Ukrainians had somehow found means to defend themselves against Russian glide bombs. And I expressed some puzzlement about this because I was not aware that any such means had in fact been found. Well, somebody very helpfully then directed me to an article that appeared back in February in Forbes by a journalist who frequently writes about the military aspects of the Ukraine war, and who I would say I think people give far too much weight to, at least in the West, and that is, of course, David Axe. Now, David Axe has written about how Russian glide bombs have been experiencing a significant reduction in effectiveness. He writes comments like this: the satellited CAB or UMPK glide bombs, each travelling 25 miles or farther under pop-out wings, were a miracle weapons for the Russians, the Ukrainian Deep State Analysis Group noted last year, and the Ukrainians had practically no countermeasures. Gradually, without many outsiders noticing, something changed. Now, as Russian forces stall outside Pokrovsk, this is written in February, mind you, it's evident that the golden era of the glide bombs has turned out to be short-lived. And the explanation is that the Ukrainians have now developed radio jammers which have become so effective and so numerous that they saturate the front line. The glide bombs can't communicate with the GLONASS satellite constellation, Russia's less sophisticated and less expansive answer to the United States' own GPS constellation. Without a steady connection for course correction, the bombs tend to stray and harmlessly explode on fields. And then David Axe tells us that it might take 8 or even 11 or even 16 bombs, glide bombs, to reliably hit one target. Now, when you actually read this article by David Axe, you discover that it is in fact a repackaging of a comment made on, republished on X by a Russian blogger, Russian blogger or Telegram channel called Fighter Bomber. Now, Fighter Bomber is actually quite well known to me. He is entirely unknown. I have no idea who this person is, but he claims to have some connection or to have some connections within the Russian Air Force. He is also, if I may say, very typical of Russian bloggers, military bloggers and military reporters about the war, in the sense that he tends to take a perennially pessimistic view of the effectiveness of the Russian military and of the actions of the military leadership. He says that everything would be well and that Russia would quickly have achieved victory, the only problem being that no one ever listens to his advice. Now, this is very common. As I said, Russian bloggers of this kind are very typical. That doesn't mean that they are not reliable often, or rather insightful commentators, and that they don't provide a lot of reliable information. But one has always to understand their particular biases, which, as I said, anybody who's familiar with this community of Russian war reporters or bloggers and commentators will know is pretty general to all of them. Now, to say it straightforwardly, there is absolutely no doubt that the Ukrainians have indeed been installing many jammers to try to deflect problems with Russian glide bombs. David Axe makes some utterly gratuitous comments about Russian military technology. Notice, for example, how he says that the GLONASS satellite constellation is less sophisticated and less expansive answer to the United States' own GPS satellite constellation. It may be less expansive, but I am quite sure, having actually seen GLONASS in operation when I've been in Russia, that it is not less sophisticated. In fact, my own understanding is that, if anything, because it uses more modern technology, it is, if anything, slightly more sophisticated than the American analog, though, frankly, the difference is minor. He also makes claims that the Russians, he also tends to dismiss Russian technology. In other ways, he says that the Russians jam too, but Russian jamming doesn't have the impact that Ukrainian jamming does. Many Russian jammers are badly made and ineffective. That is absolutely not the information I am seeing coming from the battlefields, or which I see Ukrainian soldiers claiming. And of course, he then goes on to say that, equally importantly, the best Ukrainian munitions, American-made JASSM's glide bombs and French-made Hammer glide bombs, include GPS, but also have backup inertial navigation systems, or INS, that are entirely self-contained and thus impervious to jamming. He is not here comparing like with like, because JASSMs and Hammer bombs are purpose-made, precision-guided munitions. The famous fab bombs that we hear so much about are former Soviet glide bombs, or indeed newly produced Russian glide bombs, which have been quickly converted by the Russians into precision-guided bombs by adding a package which includes wings and a receiver of GLONASS signals and that kind of thing. That is why they are so cheap. JASSM's glide bombs and French Hammer glide bombs are much, much more expensive because they are purpose-built precision bombs. The Russians also have precision-guided bombs, very similar to the JASSMs and to the Hammer glide bombs. In fact, they've been building such bombs since the 1980s. And they do also contain INS, inertial navigation systems. And the Russians have, in fact, ramped up production of them, and they are used extensively on the battlefronts, but not, obviously, in the overwhelming numbers that the fab glide bombs we've been hearing about are, because, like the American and French bombs, they are much more expensive. They're not adapted to attack, they don't become glide bombs because of a simple and cheap kit which is added to them. So we can see here that, as I said, David Axe is getting this all a bit mixed up. But anyway, let's go back briefly to fighter bomber, because of course fighter bomber then gives us explanations of what could be done to rectify this problem. And he says that, amongst other things, you could use more bombs to hit a particular target, and then you could develop munitions with laser guidance using drones for target illumination, improved television guidance and data transmission systems, invest in INS systems, because no matter what the future belongs to autonomous systems. Well, all of this, to my knowledge, is already being done. And one thing where I think he's getting it wrong, by the way, is that if we're talking about laser guidance, well, laser guidance is used, no doubt, to help fab glide bombs, carry out attacks. But a lot of what the Russians do, as I understand it, is that they use drones first to attack the jammers. First they attack the jammers with drones, and then the glide bombs go in. So, just to say, things are not as simple sometimes as David Axe appears to think, and to simply assume that the Russians don't also adapt to what the Ukrainians are doing on the battlefield, then this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield, and it explains why David Axe is getting it wrong. The glide bombs are not a miracle weapon. I know some people said that they were, but the Russians never did. They are very effective still in the battlefields. The Ukrainians have adapted to them. The Russians have adapted to them. I have been reading about accounts of Russian drones being sent in before airstrikes to knock out jammers. I'm not saying that they always succeed. No doubt very often they don't. But there it is. That is what happens today on the battlefields. Anyway, let's move on and talk about what actually has been happening on the battlefields. I am not going to go into this in a vast amount of detail, but over the last couple of hours, apparently there have been dramatic developments, especially in the Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka and Toretsk area. The Russians have apparently advanced north of Toretsk fully under their control. Nobody seriously disputes that any longer. A Russian armored column advancing north of Toretsk went as far as a village called Pleshivka, which is one of the southernmost suburbs of the city of Konstantinovka. It is possible that some Russian troops have dug in there. I think this is more like a raid than a serious offensive, just to say, but it's attracted a lot of excitement today. The Russians also appear to be on the brink of launching another offensive out of Chasiv Yar, and in the meantime, there are multiple reports that the Russians are now rapidly advancing west of Toretsk itself, also pushing towards Konstantinovka in general. Now, if you put all of this together, then it looks as if a Russian offensive is underway to create a kind of cauldron around the Ukrainian forces south of Konstantinovka. Now, I remember way back in the spring of last year, I actually suggested that something like that might eventually happen. And that is exactly what we are now starting to see. This is going to be, if it plays out in that kind of way, potentially a very, very big battle indeed, maybe the biggest cauldron in the war so far. And the interesting point about the fighting in this area is that, again, the Ukrainians are very dependent on, I believe, 2 supply roads. Overall, when you look at the kind of battle that is now playing out south of Konstantinovka, north and east of Toretsk, west of Chasiv Yar, to me, it has a kind of superficial resemblance, very superficial resemblance, to the last months of the Battle of Kursk. The Russians pressing the Ukrainians on every side, gradually shrinking the pocket, getting ever closer to the main roads, the main supply roads. Then there's a sudden cut-off of supplies, and the whole grouping collapses. The whole Ukrainian grouping collapses. It has to be pulled out in a hurry. We're probably perhaps 2 months, it's a very, very crude guess, for this whole process to play out. No doubt the Ukrainians will do the same that they did in Kursk, which is continue to reinforce in this area for as long as they can. But that, I suspect, is where that particular battle is heading. Now, we've had no news over the last 24 hours, either from the Kupiansk area, the northern area near Kupiansk, or the area near Pokrovsk or southwest Donbass. That does not mean that lot is not going on there. When I say there's been no news, I haven't picked up any news about these places. Perhaps you can find it amongst other sources, just to say. But I haven't. But it looks as if the whole situation in the Liman-Siversk area is now becoming very, very bad for the Ukrainians indeed. And I discussed yesterday an interview that an officer of the Azov, former officer of the Azov Brigade, has given, extremely critical of General Syrski. And I have to say, I wonder whether the reason that interview was given to The Guardian is because it looks as if the 3rd Azov Brigade, which is fighting in this area, about 2 weeks ago, it recaptured a small village called Nadia. It then tried to hold it in the face of relentless Russian bombing and attacks. It appears to have suffered extremely heavy losses and then was forced out of Nadia, which is back under Russian control. I wonder whether he didn't give this interview demanding Syrski's removal, in part because the 3rd Azov Brigade has been so badly chewed up in this area, and in particular in the fighting in Nadia. Anyway, overall, the story is of a rapidly developing crisis for the Ukrainians in this area. There's still no definite confirmation that the Russians hold Toretsk, but they do control certainly a lot of other places in this area as well. They are now very close to Liman. There are some reports that they've advanced south of Toretsk towards Yampol, which would in effect cut the supply lines of the garrison in Siversk. They appear to be pressing on Siversk itself from the west, which looks like a concerted move. I suspect that at some point within the next few weeks, we're going to see the entire Ukrainian defense in this area collapse. And that may not take very long, because one gets the sense also that the Ukrainians are short of reserves. And that brings me back to General Syrski, because he has given an interview which is at the same time attempts to be very optimistic. It says that the Ukrainians are about to equalize with the Russians in terms of use of fiber optic drones. The Russians perfected the use of fiber optic drones last summer. It's taken the Ukrainians a very long time to equalize, to get on top of this technology. And of course, by now, the Russians will have moved further ahead in the technology of drones as well. It is a myth that the Ukrainians have an advantage over the Russians in drones and in drone warfare. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked into this. Anyway, Syrskyi talked optimistically about those things, but he admitted that the Russian offensive in Sumy and Kharkiv region is already underway. We are getting reports now of big Russian advances in Sumy region. They're not particularly clear what they are, but it does seem as if they are extensive. And it does now seem that the Russians probably have advanced into and occupied, perhaps permanently, substantial territory in Volchansk, south of the Volcha River. So Syrskyi confirms that the Russian offensive, spring-summer offensive, has now got underway. He says that Ukraine is short of soldiers, that it needs to recruit at least 30,000 men a month, and every report I know says that Ukraine is falling far short of recruiting that total. By the way, if Ukraine needs 30,000 men a month simply to hold its positions, well, that gives us some insight as to the real level of Ukrainian casualties. They must be running at around 1,000 men a day. Just saying. So, anyway, there it is. Critical situation for Ukraine. Even General Syrskyi now admits that. And this at a very early stage in the Russian offensive, which continues, from what I can see, on all fronts. Now, what about the American talks with Iran? The United States has made all kinds of threats against Iran over the last couple of weeks. President Trump has reverted to a lot of very aggressive language against Iran. He still talks sometimes, however, about giving the appearance that he wants some kind of deal with Iran, whereby Iran abandons completely its nuclear weapons program. Now, he then said in Prime Minister Netanyahu's presence that Iran and the United States are about to start direct discussions. Netanyahu, as it turns out, had not been briefed about this in advance and was apparently very displeased, and was also displeased about the way in which Trump announced it. It turns out the Iranians weren't happy about this either, because they had understood that the agreement to hold talks with the Americans was going to be discussed secretly in a private location. It turns out that that location is Oman, and it is Omani officials who are acting as intermediaries, mediators. The Americans and the Iranians are not directly meeting with each other. They're in separate rooms, presumably in the same building, and the Omanis go and transmit ideas between themselves and between the Americans and the Iranians. They act as the intermediaries and the messengers. Well, that is, as I said, very typical of mediation exercises. Now, there is another development here, which is that the Russians have now ratified their strategic partnership treaty with Iran, and Iran has also had a meeting to discuss nuclear questions with China and Russia. So Iran is in the process of agreeing its negotiating strategy with the two most powerful states in BRICS, who are Russia and China. The United States, so far, has taken no step to consult either of these two great powers, Russia or China, about its own discussions with Iran. Now, I have to say, based on everything that has happened in the past, that I have very grave doubts that this negotiation with the United States and Iran is going to succeed. Too much always happens to throw negotiations into confusion. And the American announcement that there are negotiations underway, when the Iranians assumed that no such announcement would be made, well, that was, as I said, irritating and might affect the course of the negotiations, at least to some degree. But in theory, the basis for a deal is there. Iran has always said it doesn't want to become a nuclear power. The United States is now saying that if Iran can convince it that it is never going to become a nuclear power, then there is no reason why there should be a conflict between the United States and Iran. So both sides say they want the same thing. Iran, far from what you read in the media, is now in a much stronger diplomatic position than it was back in 2015 when the JCPOA was agreed, because it is now a member of the BRICS and has formal trade and military ties with two great powers, China and Russia. The Russians can act as guarantors of the agreement, as I've discussed many times, and they have confirmed publicly in the last couple of days, Peskov himself, on Putin's behalf, they have confirmed publicly that they are prepared to stand as guarantors for Iran in order to satisfy the United States. Now, it may be, knowing how things work, that many people in the United States would not accept Russian guarantees. But other parties can also be involved. Saudi Arabia, for example, might be one. And if this thing is managed properly, if this negotiation is conducted well, then logically there is no objective reason why it should not end in an agreement. But for that to happen, this agreement needs to be conducted in a structured, organized, and orderly way. None of this chaos we've seen with the negotiations that have been conducted with the Russians over Ukraine, none of the chaos over the tariffs, none of the chaos over TikTok and all of these things. These need to be properly conducted negotiations with skilled negotiating teams, ironing out the details, and with all the parties becoming involved. If the negotiations are conducted in that way, then there is a chance that we might actually get there and have a deal done. Now, I have seen a program in which Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, top CIA analyst, has said that he sees all of these moves as a good sign, and he's also pleased that Witkoff is apparently again a member of the American negotiating team. I agree. I think that is absolutely correct. What I would say about this is that, of course, again, Witkoff is trying to do too many things at once. Perhaps, however, focusing on Iran, getting this deal done, which it seems to me is possible, would be the best use of his talents and skills, and maybe he will succeed in them. We shall see. So, I end on a slightly positive note. I am not confident that these negotiations will succeed. Experience argues otherwise. But as they say, hope is eternal, and I'm going to cling on to hope. There we go. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.